So we're just going to there'll be a few other folks who come in, which is great, but we have a very limited amount of time and an ambitious time we want to use. So as we're waiting for a few more folks to come in, I encourage you to introduce yourselves at the table if you haven't already. And if, I see one table here that has one person, maybe we're going to encourage you to consolidate also at tables, because we're going to have a chance to talk up here and share some insights, but then we're also going to have a chance to talk at tables. So hopefully that will work well. And we have a special guest who will be joining us as well. So we have everyone. Okay, we have all of our folks. So now I get to turn to my official remarks and not just my sort of make small talk while you all gather. No, thank you. Okay. So my name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I have the privilege of being one of the leaders and conveners of this delegation, along with Samantha Roysh from Apathy is Boring, Ben Rousmel from the Circle for Democratic Solidarity, and Meredith Preston McGee from the Global Center for Pluralism. And what we're seeing today is, the rise of authoritarianism and challenges to pluralism and democracy, and even the weaponization of democracy the weaponization of pluralist ideals by authoritarian leaders. But as leaders from across Canada, we are stepping up because we believe that we have something to learn together and a responsibility to respond to this moment. We recognize that we must work to strengthen Canada's pluralistic democracy and learn and support our colleagues, you all from around the world. We also recognize that this session is just the beginning and a critical first step. But it is only that, and we hope to find ways to continue to collaborate with each of you going forward. We have an hour, and we will hear from a few of our colleagues who will share their perspectives and experience with building a pluralistic democracy. We will then have an opportunity to discuss some of the aspects of pluralist democracy at our tables, and we're going to invite you to do an activity with the ostracons on your table, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The ostracons were pieces of pottery used in ancient Athens as a democratic tool to prevent tyranny. Citizens would write the names of a politician they feared might gain too much power, and if the votes were cast, that person would be exiled for 10 years. This process helped protect the city's democracy by balancing power and limiting any single individual's influence. We're not going to do that today. But we've made a Canadian version of the ostracon here, and you'll see we have a little maple leaf on there. So our ostracon on the side without the maple leaf, we're going to ask you now to grab a piece and write down on the side without the ostracon, yes, you're going to write a solution, the problem, challenge of pluralism or problem you'd like to solve as it relates to pluralism in your work. And so the side without the maple leaf on the back side, write down the problem, and at the end we'll invite you to write down some solutions or next steps to do that. Okay. Excuse me. But with that, we are expecting a special guest. When she arrives, I think we will introduce her and another Canadian who is here as part of the forum. Okay, great. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to introduce the panel and lead that discussion.
John, thank you so much. Please welcome those of you who are coming in. Please do find a seat. As John's just been mentioning, there will be table discussion, so we do encourage all of the tables to be fully populated. So again, a big greeting to everyone. I am going to ask my panelists to briefly introduce themselves as they speak in the interest of time. We have this fairly ominous clock that's staring at me that's counting us down, so I'm conscious that time is not really on our side in this space, and we do have a huge topic in front of us. So I'm just going to make a couple of very brief framing remarks before I hand over to these four exceptional leaders that are sitting with me. And of course, when our special guest arrives, she will also say a word or two at the end of this before we turn it over to the tables. So really to start, why are we talking about pluralism as a foundation of democracies? We know that democracy is a constant negotiation of a social contract, and one that, as we've been talking about in these last couple of days, is frayed in so many places. But for us to move towards constructive dialogue, for democracy to deliver in order to push back against populist, divisive narratives, to develop systems that work for all of us, with all of our differences, with our diverse identities, and with the tensions that all of that brings, we need pluralism. But I just want to remind us that pluralism isn't just diversity. Diversity is the thing. Diversity exists in all of our societies and all of our communities around the world. It may be linguistic, it may be religious, it may be ethnic, it may be geographic, it may be generational. I could go on and on. But for democracy to work, we need tools and strategies that engage positively with that diversity. And this doesn't happen by accident. We need to see it as a strength that brings progress and innovation. We need to avoid the weaponization and division that we're seeing too often. And it's these actions and choices to engage positively with diversity and see it as a strength, that in itself is pluralism. It's the choices we make in laws and policies, in how we apply them to different members of society, in the way we engage with one another, in our narratives, how we tell our history, what we choose not to tell in our history, and how we relate to one another in order to build spaces where everyone is able to belong in the fullness of who they are, to build a sense of collective well-being and shared purpose. And when democracies do deliver on this, we are inoculated against some of the issues that we've been discussing here around authoritarianism, divisive populism, and we're able to build better and innovate and solve emerging challenges. So we know that we need to take these actions and make these choices. We know also that this is an all-of-society effort that requires action from leaders across the spectrum. We also know that this is incredibly difficult, and we need to lean into some of the common threads that our leaders here are going to speak a little bit about. Leaning into tension and disagreement, finding strategies that genuinely address exclusion, that speak to power, that cross divides and counter hate and polarization. We know as Canadians, as being sometimes overly humble, as the stereotype suggests. Somebody asked the other day what our Canadian identity is, maybe that's some of it. But that we know that what exists right now in what is now called Canada is not a singular experience. It's not a model by any stretch of the imagination. It's an unfinished and imperfect project. But the leaders that are sitting here, I think, can share some really important insights and lessons about what we've learned from some of the challenges that we've faced in trying to apply pluralism in different parts of society, what some of those tensions are. And because I believe really strongly that for us to have action, we need to leave with hope. And I was very fortunate actually 3 weeks ago to see Dr. Jane Goodall in one of her last talks in Ottawa. And she spoke a lot about the power of hope, and that without that, you don't act. So I am going to task the leaders to leave us with a moment of hope as they kick off with these insights. So the question we are asking is that pluralism exposes the hardest truths about identity, power, and belonging. So in all of your work, what challenges do you face to this? And what practices have you seen that moves the needle to more inclusive, pluralist democracy? I then have a very specific welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Just want to pause for a moment. Chrystia Freeland, it's such a great pleasure to have you with us. Canada's Special Envoy for Ukraine, newly minted. Congratulations. Thank you so much. We're just beginning the panel, and then we'll come to you at the end, if that's okay. Great, thanks so much. So I have a specific question for each of our panelists. So Dominique, I'm going to start with you. As a politician, recovering politician? Retired politician? Do politicians ever really retire? Maybe that's a question to ask.
Only when we die. That's what one of my Ukrainian friends said. He said the only totally retired politician is a dead politician.
But Dominique, I want to ask you, the political systems today seem to de-incentivize these instincts towards pluralism, towards bringing people together, both in action and rhetoric. So what do you see about how politicians can engage in pluralism, in both action and rhetoric, in a way that wins the political debates?
Thank you very much for the question, Meredith, and hello to all of you. So the first thing I would like to say is we tend to believe that elected officials understand what pluralism is and understand what democracy is, because you go through an election and therefore you understand like what all those things mean. But it's not reality. It's not really the reality. I think there are two elements that are really important when we talk about what we need to do, is time and timing. Anybody here ran as a candidate in an election? Raise your hand. So 2 people. Anybody wants to run in the future? 2 people. So that's not that many, right? The thing is, when you approach to run for an election, you get bombarded, you decide to run, you have to make a decision quickly, you have to start being good at talking about education and healthcare and environment and education, all kinds of topics that you don't necessarily master. And you get elected. If your party is in power, you become a minister very quickly. And there's no more time for you to step back and think. So my thinking is when a person is already elected, it's almost already too late to start talking about this. We have to talk way before the person is elected to have those conversations. When we talk about, I was talking about time, we don't have enough time, but there's a question of timing. The right time to have those conversations is when there is actually a leadership contest, where people are in a position and they're willing to listen to what people have to say. And very often, and I see, Chrystia, you're shaking your hands because you know what it is to be in power and not having the ability to think. So you need to reach out to these people in these moments. Also, you need to identify the people that can make the changes. Not all politicians are good. Not all of them are good. It requires, I think, to be a good politician, it requires, aside from it have a high level of integrity, you need to have the curiosity to learn, you need to have the ability to learn fast, you need to have the capacity to act. We need to identify these people ahead of time so we can have those conversations with the leaders. And if I think about what in Canada we need to do, it's funny because yesterday I was talking to Lisa Witter, I'm looking at Lisa Witter, and she said, you know, there's about 50,000 people in parliament globally. 50,000, and I'm like, 50,000? That's not that many people when you think of it. And I'm right now in education in a school where every year we train 5,000 people. So I'm thinking, could we not develop something about pluralism, fighting polarization, develop a curriculum that we could deploy to 50,000 people? Wouldn't that be a great achievement that we could do? I think there are initiatives that we can actually take in order to influence what's going on. The other thing that I would like to say is, why is there polarization? There is polarization because polarization works. So if you're fighting that trend, what do you need as a leader, as an elected official, to fight that trend? You need courage. And courage and courageous leaders, few and far between. So I'm looking at all of you that are really interested in democracy and pluralism and fighting polarization. When you have a courageous politician that is going out there and doing things, it would be good for the civil society to say, hey, this is a good job. But very often we're afraid of doing this because then, God forbid, you would be partisan, right? But we need to have more people that are courageous to do stuff as elected officials, but also organizations to support them as elected officials. And I think that's one way of approaching this issue.
Dominique, thank you so much. That's a great start for us. And I love the concreteness, particularly around the training of parliamentarians. Hayden, if I might turn over to you. So again, specific question to you. That we also know that in some cases, pluralistic democracies have to grapple with legacies of colonization, addressing the harms, but also reconciling state sovereignty with pre-existing indigenous societies and their sovereignty. So I was wondering if you can speak to how and if pluralist democracies can meet that challenge and what needs to be done.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it's a really difficult one. I'm here on this panel as a part of Canada's attempt to embark in reconciliation, right? To try to address how you practice democracy when that practice is based on the dispossession of Indigenous peoples and hundreds of years of a different type of democracy. How is that possible? How do we do that? And I'm not necessarily sure Canada has come up with an answer collectively. I think we're struggling through it. The attempt at reconciliation has been fraught. It's been one where we've had commissions and lawsuits and ongoing negotiations through generations to try to carve out a space for Indigenous sovereignty parallel to, among, underneath Canadian sovereignty. And typically they tend to fail. All of those efforts tend to fail because the very principles of liberal democracy are relatively, well, we can't talk about those. So things like the rule of law, individual rights, the national interest, those are foundational to pluralistic societies. And I think without talking about them openly, especially in an Indigenous context, all we're really going to have are these symbolic gestures at inclusion. How can Indigenous people participate in this liberal democracy as opposed to resurrecting and revitalizing and practicing Indigenous forms of democracy? And I think the practice of Indigenous politics over these past few generations, and particularly in this moment, has tended to demonstrate that pluralism can also grapple with conflict, a conflict-based pluralism, or maybe it's an agonistic approach to politics where we can create these incremental gains through conflict, through fighting. I mean, there's only bad politicians in my experience. You know, no offense to the politicians in the room, but that's our experience. So we have to fight and we have to push. And liberal democracy, pluralist democracy actually serves as a foundation to be able to do that work. Because we've seen in Canada that through that fight, through that conflict, whether it's about institutions or values, we actually do have examples, geographic pockets of parallel sovereignty where Indigenous democracy is being exercised. We have the evolution of collective rights in a Canadian context. In fact, we even have some degree of liberal pluralism, which I think among liberal democracies is exceptionally rare. In each of these cases, each of these incremental gains, I don't think that I would say that we're a success, we're a pluralistic success that other democracies that are engaged in the same conversation, and there are a handful of them, would emulate. But I think it allows us to think differently about pluralism at the foundational level. Like there are things that we can do to include minorities and include those with diverse opinions. But I think only if we get to the structural, only if we're actually talking about those foundational elements of democracy, then are we talking about transformative change. Otherwise, it's superficial, it's symbolic, it's performative. And I think that's what Indigenous politics brings to this discussion. And I think that I'm optimistic because I see in my family and my cousins and my relatives that fight continues on, and we make those incremental shifts that hopefully one day soon will result in the transformation and that long hoped for reconciliation.
Hayden, thank you. I think that point also about the foundational transformative requirement, as agonistic as it is, but is at its heart what pluralism requires of us, that it isn't inclusion into a system that pre-exists, right? It has to be transformative for all of us. Mohammed, if I can turn over to you and begin by congratulating you, because I understand you've just been reappointed. Mohammed, as you lead a federal crown corporation mandated to focus on issues of racism across Canada, and in the last few years, we've seen an unprecedented rise in hate. So I want you to talk a little bit about what you see as the triggers and accelerators of that rise, but also what you're seeing both at the policy level and among communities to counter that, and what you see is working.
That's a big question.
In 5 minutes.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm just going to build upon what Professor King had said, where I think Canada is an evolving experiment. When I look at the Yukon, where there's 14 nations, out of which 11 of them have self-governing treaties, like the way they operate is extremely different than the way it's in Ontario and other provinces, because there is the necessity to work collaboratively together. Is it the perfect model? I don't know. Is it working? I don't know. I know that it's working differently, and I know it's producing results that people feel a greater sense of ownership towards, and a greater sense of responsibility towards. So I think it's an evolving project. But what I think I want to pivot a little bit to think about, because this conference is really messing up my headspace, to be honest. Because we're talking about democracies creating pluralism. And I think fundamentally we need to think about, for what? Is it for people to have freedom? Is it for people to have equal opportunity? Is it for people to have economic opportunity? Like, for what exactly? And I think that, and I bring it back to that question because I think when you define those, you come down to the bare necessities of what are your basic human rights? What are the things that are untouchable? What are the democratic institutions that create a separation between the political and what's inherently yours? And I think that in Canada we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we also have a loophole called the Notwithstanding Clause, which has really been tested in the last number of years of its implementation. But our charter still stands as a very good example of what is basic human rights. And when I think about pluralism, I think it comes down really to the test where when you see minority groups affirming their rights, you automatically see a backlash. So when you see migrant groups pushing back to say, like, this is ridiculous. When you see people calling out, I remember when one of the previous governments, there was an article that was published by Maclean's magazine that was just vilifying Muslims and deeply Islamophobic. They got sued under Section 13 of the Human Rights Code. And the government of the day was just like, nope, that's an imposition, we don't feel that's appropriate. And they got rid of Section 13 from the Human Rights Code. And Act, sorry. And essentially, that was an assertion of rights from minority groups that was met with a resistance from the state to say, nah, you've gone too far. And I think that the real test of pluralism is how when minority groups can assert their rights and the state backs them. Now, I've seen a variety of ways this has been implemented, both good and bad ways. I do a lot of work on hate crimes across this country. We work with policing, we work with Crown prosecutors. And I gotta tell you, the test of policing pro-Palestinian protests has become a lightning rod in that space, where some people are over-policing, some people are being accused of under-policing. But to be, and I don't want to provide verdict on this yet, but when I see the degree of due diligence being created by the courts, not like, and the police too, to some degree, but how the courts are creating lines. In this current context, I actually feel more encouraged that the system is working in a way that it should, and protecting the rights of minorities, particularly in times when their belonging is being challenged, and their belonging to say what is true to them is being challenged.
Thanks, Mohammed, for ending on a note of hope. Maiwand, I want to turn next to you. We've been talking a lot about authoritarianism over the last couple of days. A lot of concern that democracy focuses too much on elections and not on some of the undergirding that is required for democratic societies to really be able to thrive. And you work, of course, on civic space and supporting activists in exile. And I think civic space is such an important indicator, really, of a democratic space, particularly a pluralist democracy. So can you say a word or two about how what you've seen about within Canada, especially supporting activists in exile who've now sought protection there, how does Canada help them practice this, not as an abstract ideal, but something that we're able to live, and ensure that those marginalized voices that are now finding themselves in Canada are able to genuinely participate in the project?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and share this space with all of you. So about 4 years ago, I was forced into exile from my own country, my home country of Afghanistan, and I was in Turkey and in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan, different countries waiting to be relocated to another country in North America. And then around 3 years ago, when I was still there, I got a call, and they said that I have an option of going to Canada if I choose to do so, in addition to the country that I was initially planned to go. And it took me probably a few seconds to say yes. And the reason for that was that when you're out of Canada, you have this image of Canada as being this great country, being super welcoming, that respects diversity, that's pluralistic, that is human rights and democracy are sort of the core values. However, when I came to Canada after a few weeks or probably a few months, that it took me that I realized that the Canada that I imagined is so different from the Canada that I experienced. And that kind of describes the challenges that one faces when you are forced into exile and are entering a new space as good as Canada, yet you feel excluded, silenced, not part of the social fabric of the society in the way that you were expecting to be. However, it's important to know that exile is not the end. For us, those of us who are pushed into exile from our countries, we look at it as an opportunity to renew our commitment for the causes that we fought in our home countries and to continue that fight at the global stage for the betterment of our home countries, but also to contribute to the civic and political space of our adapted new countries. When I came to Canada, I saw a lot of possibilities, and I will come to that as well, but it didn't take me long to realize that you're boxed. I was fixed boxed as a Afghan, and then Muslim, and then refugee, and then a victim of oppression and exile and all of that. It takes you a lot of effort to claim the space and agency that you want to be seen as somebody with agency, voice, and power, and an ambition to contribute to the society that you have chosen or kind of decided to go there and live there. I think it's not correct to take this for granted that you reach to a country like Canada, that everything will be, that you're accepted, you're respected, you're valued, and you have the agency and voice that you need to continue your work. So it does require a lot of effort. And that sense of agency for me is also linked to pluralism and the sense of belonging, because once you know that you are respected, that you are not seen always as somebody in need of help. Because when I was reaching out to people to talk about democracy in Canada, the initial response was, do you need a job? Like, because you're new. I mean, it's not unnatural. So you're new and you want to reach out to somebody in a new country. So the initial is like, do you need a job? Do you need? So there's already an assumption of the kind of needs you have. And you also look at the literature on exile, on newcomers, on refugees. Like 95% of more of that is all about the basic needs of newcomers. It hardly talks about the needs like agency, like power, like voice, like being able to contribute and get involved in a meaningful way today to enriching the cultural, social, and political space in the home country. So that's something that I think Canada, there's a lot of possibilities in Canada, but it's also Canada, like many other countries, has a lot to do to create that space and enrich it as sort of a culture of welcoming diversity and pluralism. And then my last point on this round, looking at civic space and pluralism as an ecosystem of organizations from media to civil society to nonprofits, charities, foundations, community organizations. And when you have an ecosystem approach to developing democracy, to protecting civic space, to enriching pluralism, that's where you can contribute in a meaningful way to strengthening these values. But when you exclude any part of this ecosystem, it becomes fragile and it becomes vulnerable to risks, to attacks, to threats that we're seeing around the world and in our region as well. And lastly, I think civic space and democracy, it's about daily exercise, daily actions, daily work. When we all need not to take democracy, civic space, and our values, Canadian values and global values for granted. And Canada is now ranked among the 5th freest country in the world. So we are among the top 5 free country in the world. But the question is not that we should be proud of that necessarily. We should be, but it's about what are we doing with that freedom? Are we taking it for granted? Or are we making sure every day that we strengthen it in Canada, but also we leverage and use it to protect freedom and democracy and share it with people around the world? And then to end with a point of hope, I think one thing that autocrats want as also is to take hope from us. By pushing us into exile, by repression, by division, by polarization, it's important to build hope, not only as a mental state for well-being, but as a strategy to push back, to fight back. And it's important also to note the sources of hope. I see hope today in the court systems in the US. I see hope in activists pushing for protests in Canada, in the US, and other countries. I see hopes in foundations that are stepping up and responding to the needs of the moment in support of democracy. I see hope in journalists that are fighting repression and activists in Ukraine and women in Tehran and in Kabul. So all of these places are where you need to see hope, not only in governments and politicians. Thank you.
Maiwand, thank you. When I moved back to Canada to take on the role, several people said to me, well, pluralism is in Canada's DNA. And I've repeatedly reminded people that it is not cellular, it is muscular. And if you don't use it, you lose it. And I think everything that has been mentioned so far just really reminds us we have to use it, we can't be complacent, and we have to continue this work. So Christy, if I may, you've heard these exceptional leaders and their insights. Would love to have your thoughts before we open it to the table discussions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. What a great conversation. I want to start by asking who here is Canadian? Okay, so this is mostly Canadians. Okay, it's mostly Canadians talking to each other, a few non-Canadians. Look, I want to say 3 sets of things. The first thing I want to say is I love the hopeful conclusion, and I'll try to get there myself, but I think we need to live in the truth. And I think we need to start by recognizing these are dark days for democracy, right? Democracy is not doing too well in the world, and it's not doing too well in a lot of countries. And we have to really recognize that that's where we are in the world today. And I think we also have to kind of really recognize everyone here, I'm prepared to bet in, the big fight between democracy and authoritarianism is team democracy, right? So we're kind of speaking to the converted, and that's not a bad thing. It's necessary because we need to kind of think of what are our strategies. But I think we also need to recognize that there are other rooms where a lot of the truths universally acknowledged on this panel and in this room are fiercely challenged. So that's my first kind of level set. I think it's important, second point, to think about what are our strengths in Canada. I love the democracy is muscular, not cellular. But I think we have a few key strengths, and I want to mention them because let's keep them. Number 1, we have really fierce limits on money in politics. $17.50 maximum donation. Say that. Are there any Americans here? Right? Okay, think about that, right? Like Dominique and I have both run in leadership campaigns. The single biggest donor to my campaign was my dad, who's a farmer in northern Alberta. No one could donate more than he did. That changes the whole nature of the political discourse. And let's not forget that. Number 2, et je veux saluer Madame Anglade, on a travaillé ensemble en tant que ministre. Une chose qui est cellulaire pour le Canada, c'est notre diversité. Something that is fundamental about Canada is we are diverse from our very beginnings. And that structural diversity of our country, French and English, Indigenous people in Canada, ethnic diversity now, huge regional diversity. I think that it is a real advantage in the country being pluralism of necessity. And any successful national leader has to take on board some of that pluralism. A third thing that Mohammed talked about, strong institutions. And I think we're seeing in other parts of the world where you don't have strong institutions, and it's not just the structure of the institution, it's not just the laws, it's the people who are heading those institutions have to have courage. So if anyone here is a judge or wants to be a judge or wants to be a police officer, or wants to be someone in the public service, those are incredibly important roles, and they are part of building a strong democracy. A final thing I want to say that I think is so important for democracy and is maybe not always part of these conversations is a strong social safety net and a pretty good support for a regular person. I think that it can be very, very hard to make the case for democracy if a middle class, a working person feels they are not in a society where they're okay and where they feel that, they are in peril. I think Medicare and now early learning and childcare are fundamental pillars of Canadian democracy, and we should connect the social conversation with the political conversation. What are our challenges? I'm kind of surprised people haven't really been talking too much about social media and media in general. I may be betraying my roots as a former journalist, But this is something I am so concerned about. Canada's diversity and the French language protects us somewhat because the French language is a very good moat against American media. But still, you know, we are seeing our media organizations weakened, and we're seeing social media being very powerful and very often eroding of democracy. Second thing, kind of perversely, our diversity can make things hard for us. And Dominique was absolutely right to say that, you know, polarization, which I think, you know, if you are kind of a pundit type person, you will often lament polarization and say how bad it is. But political strategists, they sometimes love polarization, right? Like that's how you activate your base. And in a country that has natural diversity, you can find a lot of wedges. And I think we need to be thoughtful about that as Canadians. And then my final thing I'm worried about is, you know, I do think our relatively strong social safety net is a great protection. But I really worry about young Canadians. I worry about how hard it is for young Canadians to establish themselves, that it's too hard to buy a house in a lot of our big cities, that it's too hard to kind of set up your family life. And that kind of discontent, I think, can be fertile ground for a view that, and this is now my final point, and we've been talking a lot about what I would sort of describe as the values side of democracy, which, look, I totally, totally believe in. But at the end of the day, democracy, certainly in Western industrialized societies, where we kind of take it for granted, where we haven't lived with, you know, 10 years of censorship and authoritarianism and, you know, a knock on the door at night and secret police. In countries like ours, the test is going to be, is my democracy delivering for me in my life? Is it delivering a good life for me, my family, my kids? That includes agency. It includes freedom. But democracy has to focus on, and people who care about democracy, we have to really talk about how can we deliver for our people. And if we get that right, we're going to be unstoppable.
Christia, thank you so much. And I think on that last point, as we move into the tables, I do think that we want to think a little bit also about what does pluralism enable us to do to bring diverse groups together, say in Canada, around communities and so forth, to bring their various perspectives to a problem that needs to be solved for democracy to deliver for a community, whether it is a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, or many of the other challenges that we're facing, and that we really need to lean into bringing diverse voices around that table and finding a constructive way through, which we really hope we can do. So I would like all of you to join me in thanking this exceptional panel of speakers and leaders. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. And I'm going to hand back over to John, or I'm not going to hand over to John.
But I would just ask that because we knew we would run out of time, but I would love. We knew that we would run out of time, but we actually haven't heard that people introducing at least what organization they are with on our panel yet. So if you could just do a quick round to say your name and your organization, so that all of us who are here who want to reconnect with you afterwards can do that, including Christia Freeland, like proper introduction.
Great. Maybe Hayden, can we start with you?
Sure. My name is Hayden King. I'm from the Yellowhead Institute.
Maiwand Rahyab, I'm the founder and CEO of Resilient Society. It's an emerging Canadian global organization focused on protection of civic space and exiled activists.
Hello, I'm Dominique Anglade. I'm associate professor at HSM Montréal, and I lead the executive education program over there.
Hang on to this one. Meredith Preston McGee. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism.
Mohammed Hashim, and I run the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is a federal crown corporation within the Department of Canadian Heritage.
Yeah, see, one of those public servants who we rely on so much. Thank you. I'm Chrystia Freeland. I'm the former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, and now Special Representative for the Reconstruction of Ukraine.
John, I think I'm handing back over to you to set the tables, because all of you now have a bit of pluralist work to do.
Okay, so in the zero time we have remaining, I think what we're going to do is a bit of a pivot. Just because we've had such a strong turnout here, let us have an opportunity to go around. We have these ostracons on the table. So on the back side, you're supposed to put the back side of your ostracon. You're supposed to write a challenge. So maybe you can introduce yourself at the tables, write your challenge down, and share that. And then on the other side, to put something you're going to take away as a learning here and share that. So if we can do that at the tables, introducing yourself, the organizations, and then what our hope is that, and a recognition that this is just a first step, and that you will connect, that you will build relationships that go on and lead out of this room, both with our panels here, with everyone at your table, and we are all here for the remainder of this forum together. Right?